views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hey everybody, we are here for the Bronx Buzz, and it is a pleasure to be with you. As you may know, this is our Bronx Reporters Roundtable. We bring in Bronx reporters so you can get an idea what they're thinking about, what they write about, maybe a little insight as to who they actually are, and to learn a little bit more about the things going on around us all in the Bronx. Tonight we have two excellent editors, and we don't always get that all at once, but I'm thrilled that David Cruz, the editor of the Norwood News, is with us, and Deborah Lee Santos, the editor of the Bronx Free Press, is with us. Thank you both for returning to our program.
Thank you.
It's always great to have you. Deborah Lee, let's start with you. First of all, just in general, how's the paper? We were just talking a moment ago about how busy you are. I guess in your mind, with everything going on, I wish I could cover this. I wish I could cover that. So just give us an insight as to what you're dealing with every day.
Well, every day we're dealing with Trumplandia. I mean, that's the everyday, challenge.
Even though it's local, but not local, really.
It could not be more local.
Really?
It could not be. I don't remember the last time that we felt the weight of an administration, and a presidential administration, on a daily basis. I mean, if you're talking about immigration, if you're talking about transgender students, if you're talking about Muslim citizens and residents, there is not a single individual, or just women for that matter, there's not a single individual who doesn't feel the weight of this administration in a very direct, personal way.
And you could start, I mean, you talked about women, or you could go to immigration, and gee, I wonder how many of us are interested in healthcare. I mean, it's all wrapped up.
But it's also really personal. Like, I remember having a conversation with someone about the fact that I'm exhausted, and I imagine a lot of people are as well, but I also have to recognize my own privilege because I'm not an undocumented individual, and I get to kiss my kids off in the morning and send them off and have a reasonable expectation of seeing them in the evening unless I'm on deadline.
Right.
As opposed to worrying about the fact that I may have to contact a relative about getting them from school.
Right, and that I'm sure you're well aware is a real fear that they say, gee, I may do it, and maybe this will be the day there's a knock on the door. And what is most disturbing to me, and I'm sure to many Americans, you could be a lawful person and a productive person with a family. Maybe you came here under some difficult circumstances, or you were kind of fathered in or grandfathered in from a family member or whatever. So I understand that. So on top of dealing with local issues, there is this very oppressive, I'm sure David feels the same way. Let's talk more specifically about Rikers Island. A lot of talk about closing Rikers Island. What's going to happen at Rikers Island? We did a show with the Bronx DA who is for it, but there's a lot of things that have to happen, specifically alternatives. Where are we at as far as Rikers Island?
Well, there seems to be a groundswell of support for closing the facility. Again, I mean, that's a conversation that gets renewed every so often. We're at the point now where perhaps that level of grassroots activity that's swelled up in the face of the administration may in fact translate to people looking at criminal justice reform more seriously. Governor Cuomo has championed the closing of Rikers. The advocates, again, have sort of renewed that conversation. You have the Khalif Browder documentary that's out again. And then you have this family that for us is a Bronx family, and a Bronx family that has suffered greatly at Rikers. And the idea then becomes, what would you do? And you're right, it is a complicated process. But as has been duly noted, the mayor, who has been tentative about the subject, is certainly willing to devote a lot of time to other complicated projects like rail line projects and light rail projects, rather. And so complicated shouldn't be a reason for us to desist. It should be a reason for us to really get involved.
You know, I really am a big supporter of the notion of alternatives to incarceration, and even just like we do in healthcare, preventative things. And maybe the general public doesn't view things like that, but community centers, arts programs, all these things, ways for young people to express themselves, finding role models in the neighborhoods. I believe if you have that, then you'll still have a less of a problem at Rikers Island. But we never seem to invest in those things. And frankly, given what we're getting out of the federal government, it's like,
what now?
We're getting even less.
And the youths, the fact that 16 and 17-year-olds are being routinely sent to Rikers Island is really appalling, because what they're doing is mixing in a prison population that is made up of folks who have been there for many years and frankly they're return offenders, they're repeat offenders.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is that there's nothing in place at Rikers Island for any kind of reform. They're not going to come back to their neighborhoods, and we see this with Khalif Browder writ large, but we see it also in smaller ways, in smaller instances, where people don't return back to their neighborhoods in ways that are productive or constructive.
And you led into really what was next on my list, and that is this whole notion of raise the age.
Right.
So, you know, and I'll just articulate it for people who haven't fully understood what this means. If you're a 16-year-old and you do something wrong, and we were all younger, I know David was a perfect child, and so he never did anything wrong. But we were all younger, and we did something wrong, and you were a 16-year-old, and really you made a bad mistake, and you did something, and then you get...
or even a silly mistake.
That's right, whatever it is, and you get incarcerated. Now you're dealt with as an adult, and it follows you the rest of your life, and just what you said, you're incarcerated in a situation that's not going to help you learn to do better.
Right.
What do we need to do, and who's at the forefront of it? What happens next?
Well, New York is one of only 2 states in this country, with North Carolina, that will try 16 and 17-year-olds as adults.
Isn't that unbelievable?
That is really, that's the word, and perhaps even appalling. The idea that at 16, and as you said, we all remember ourselves at 16. I don't think that we want to be hauled before a judge on any number of counts.
That's right.
So there is a movement on the part of state legislators to also look to raise the age, and you have that coming from the IDC, the Independent Democratic Conference. You have that coming from also Democrats in the state Senate. You have some resistance, as is to be expected, from Republicans because they want to continue to be tough on crime, and that's always been the position.
So-called tough on crime is, you know.
Let's hope that this is a year where the idea that 16 and 17-year-olds be remanded into, real juvenile facilities where there's real opportunities for them to grow from these experiences happens.
You mentioned the IDC. We hadn't talked about that. We were going to bring it up. I'm just curious. Do you think this is the right thing for New York State? Do you think it's an effective body? Are you a fan? I mean, how do you view the IDC?
I think they've proven that they can be progressive and pragmatic at once. I think that they have, as you know, widened their ranks. They now have a number of new members. They have the first Dominican American woman who has joined the Senate. They have Jesse Hamilton as well. I think that they're probably brokering an opportunity left and right, and I mean that obviously pun intended, to have
how convenient.
Yes, to have conversations that perhaps were not being had before. Where that leads will really be a function of the leadership there. I would hope that there continues to be a commitment to dialogue that in fact has led to progressive legislation.
Progressive reform.
Yeah.
Do you sympathize with Democrats who say, you know what, let's just get everybody on board and play?
I sympathize with anyone who's able to have a conversation, a civil conversation about things that matter. And I suspect that the Democrats, in fact, can do so. They have done so. And perhaps there's a future there where there will be some brokered peace.
I am really, really happy because I'm sitting with 2 people who are not afraid to say what they think. And I deal with a lot of reporters who think it's their job to not have something to say. But both of you guys are just great. So thank you very much. David, let's start with you. You did something today that you told me about, and I didn't find out more about it. So now tell us all. You presented at Columbia University today.
Yeah, I was.
Do tell. Come on, brag away.
I was just invited by the Columbia Scholastic Press Association to just talk about community newspapers and why it should be a really good stop for people who are just starting out. And it was about a 45-minute presentation that I gave to students, college students and high school students from all over the country, which was very, very interesting. And the takeaway there was that community newspapers are essentially a training ground for journalists who want to have a really bright career ahead. I've met a couple of them in my time who've been who started out as community journalists, and then they moved on to bigger and better places. And that exposure definitely helps them succeed.
There's no bigger or better place than our newsrooms. What are you talking
There you
about?
go. I was just going to say, around this particular round table, you will probably not get more enthusiasm for community journalism and the value of it.
I definitely value it.
Well, listen, you and I on off camera have had many discussions about the state of the fact that we've lost so many small newspapers and the struggle that you both know it is to keep it going. Just before we even get into some specifics, for you, what has been the effect of the Norwood News on that part of the Bronx, on that community? I mean, it seems so obvious, but I think it's worth articulating.
Well, I actually, when I was thinking about the presentation, one thing I've realized that most newspapers, including the Bronx Free Press, can be is they're leaders. You may be surprised that they are essentially a community leader, and they help start the conversation by essentially just putting out issues. Sometimes these are issues that are just talked about among a group, but with mass media, it essentially amplifies the conversation a lot more and helps foster some level of change.
I'll repeat something that I probably have said on this show, and I've said it any time it's come up. Years ago, I asked Buddy Stein, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning publisher of the Riverdale Press, why does Riverdale do so well? In other words, we realize the economy works for them up there, and but you have responsive elected officials by and large, whereas you don't really have that across the board in the borough of the Bronx. And he responded and said one of the reasons is because we've had an award-winning newspaper. Right. And so we hold elected officials' feet to the fire. If something's not right in a particular section, we talk about it in a responsible way. And I think that's a large part of it. And certainly for both of your papers, I think it's just so important that we keep them going. But of course, I would feel that way. Anyway, David, let's talk about some of the real important things that you wrote about, in particular this idea of rent history forms. And apparently landlords, and this is a perfect example of why community journalism is so important, apparently landlords are skipping the idea of showing new tenants the history of the rent in their apartments, so they have no framework to understand what their rent should or should not be.
Right.
Do tell.
So there's essentially these forms called rent registration forms that are supposed to be sent to the state. Oftentimes, a tenant can request one, but sometimes the landlord doesn't even bother to even mention that you can have access to a rent registration form to understand how much rent you'll be paying. And you're basing that rent on the rent history of a particular apartment. And so, for example, if I'm giving you an apartment for I say I didn't give you an apartment for $990, a landlord could be sending a rent registration form to the state saying that the person is actually paying $1,400. But
so you think that's what the value of the apartment is worth? Oh my God.
Well, that's what the landlord is saying.
I understand that.
But then if the tenant ends up leaving and a new tenant comes in, they will say that the previous tenant had paid $1,400.
Never showing the $990.
Correct. Well,
wow.
$990 or rent registration
whatever it
form.
was.
So this group, Once Bronx Housing, is alleging that, and I reached out to the state. The state says that they do have protocols in place to monitor this kind of behavior. Although I'm not sure if I really 100% believe it, only because there's just so many apartments out there.
Well, of course. I wonder if the Attorney General's office, if Eric Schneiderman's office is aware of it.
The group, West
I'm
Bronx
not telling
Housing.
you who to call, but
no, they are.
It sounds like that would be my next phone call.
They're reaching out to elected officials, and they're reaching out to the Attorney General's office to see whether or not there is a case. And they're, in the article that I wrote, I sort of briefly mentioned it because it is not part of our coverage area, but they're zeroing in on a building in Riverdale that is essentially seeing a lot of these this problem.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Before we take a break, I want to talk about Catholic schools that there are 4 in the Bronx that are going to be closing. Parents, much like in the public schools when a school gets closed, and you've even written about, in the paper has been a story about a school closed in the Bronx, in a public school closed. Anyway, what's the effect? People, I guess parents at St. Anne's are all upset.
Right. Well,
tell me what's going on.
Yeah, they're pretty much scrambling to find a new school for their kids by September. And at this point, St. Anne's has about close to 300 students. The Archdiocese of New York says that kids won't have to worry, but at the same time, it really complicates people's routines, their lives, and also, I guess, their own level of spirituality too.
Yeah, well, you say you don't have to worry, but you're not the one who has to get the kid like to somewhere to school by 7:50 a.m. somewhere across the Bronx, where especially like we had earlier this week in a storm or weather is
like that too. It's like it's logistical, but it's also institutional because you're losing something. I mean, it's not just about new schedules. You're losing what is a cornerstone.
And the building will definitely be empty.
Yeah,
right. What's going to come from it.
I realized I had kind of mixed and matched because it was your paper that did a thing about Junior High School 145 was closing. That was the public school I was thinking of.
Yeah.
But before we take a break, I want to ask you, the SOMOS conference is coming up. And so tell me what your interest is and why that is significant.
Well, it's marking its milestone anniversary. It's 30 years in. And if you can imagine what it takes to put together two conferences, a year, you can imagine that it's an organization that's really sought to endure and has done so, I think, the focus has always been it's a legislative platform. Obviously, there's networking and there's advocacy and all the rest. But I do find that very much like Buddy Stein was saying, there's an opportunity for us both as civilians and as reporters and editors and all the rest to show up and to hold our elected officials and our advocates responsible and accountable.
The tough questions.
Yeah, and to be present. To be present. To be present means that you're actually then involved in the conversation. If you sit it out, you're not actually engaging. And
one other piece of good news, I was really pleased to read in the Norwood News that you and WFUV had made some sort of relationship. But I asked you, privately, and we'd never got to talk about it. So tell me what that sounds really healthy to me.
Well, Fordham University is essentially like a 10-minute drive, and I always thought that they have this powerhouse institution, WFUV, and I ended up just reaching out to the Mass Communications Department to just see what we can do in terms of a collaboration. And so we thought about this 5-part series called Bronx Barriers, which is essentially taking an ongoing issue and exploring it. And the idea there was to bring in reporters who radio reporters, but can adapt their stories to a print format.
Great.
And thought it was a very interesting concept.
I love the idea, and frankly, at WFUV, and I listen to it all the time, but they are, even though they're in the Bronx, they don't really get involved in the Bronx, and the fact that you have engaged them, I think, is really a wonderful thing. So hats off to David Cruz, also to Deborah Lee Santos from the Bronx Free Press and the Norwood News. And we're going to take a break. We come back. The news out today was that Mayor de Blasio will not be charged in the pay-for-play scheme. So we're going to talk about that and maybe some other items too. Don't go away.
Sure, I look cute now, but when my owner lost his job, it was rough. I was living on the street, and one night, me and this Cocker Spaniel got into it so bad, I wound up looking like an ice cream cone. I cried a little bit, but thankfully I got rescued, so I'm running, I'm jumping, all back to my old self. And I'm ready to give unconditional love, even if you put a lampshade on my head.
It's not always easy being a dad.
Do you have panda asthma too? Does that run in the family? This is the home of the most priceless kung fu artifacts.
But when you make an effort...
Dad, we're not supposed to touch anything. Oh, sorry. Go long, son!
It's always worth it.
Whoa! Faster!
The smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life. Take time to be a dad today.
I am gonna get you. I'm gonna get you.
Call 877-4DAD-411 or visit fatherhood.gov to learn more.
Hamilton was adopted from a rescue in 2008. He really likes to be around people. And as soon as I start to make my breakfast, Hamilton is right there. I get out my mat and I'm doing a downward dog and he's underneath. He's quite the pug about town. He gets invited to a lot of parties. He knows he's a pretty big deal. I mean, look at this little face. How would you not love him?
Okay, back with you on the Bronx Buzz. We are thrilled that the editor of the Bronx Free Press, Deborah Lee Santos, is here, and also David Cruz, the editor from the Norwood News, is here. Deborah Lee, let's start with you. It was came out today that Mayor de Blasio will not be charged in this conflict of interest scheme. I forget which one of you asked it before we started the show. Do you think it has any relation to the fact that Preet Bharara was was forced to resign, or in essence was fired, and then all of a sudden it's dropped, or you think the case just went on and that was the result of it? Or there's no way to know?
There's, there are always ways to know, but this just happened.
Spoken like a true journalist.
Right, but this just happened, and into due diligence and deference to all the parties involved, let's do our investigations, right? Let's ask the questions. But to the extent that the two are coincidental, it was always expected, and in fact, the right signals had been sent by both Cy Vance, the Manhattan DA, and Preet Bharara that these investigations would come to some sort of conclusion, whether that meant charges would be brought or not, before, in fact, we really got underway in terms of the campaign season. So this was an expectation that, and in fact, the de Blasio administration said that they had openly advocated for some level of resolution because they wanted to be able to get in the clear, according to them, and now they've done so.
I think it's fair that happened, and it's nice to know that there was kind of a sense of at least decency for the public, so that they don't have to go into the campaign season with more questions. We know what happened in the national elections and the kinds of questions that brought up.
I think the question now becomes, it was still rather stinging. I mean, the reports in quote unquote exonerating the administration, it was also clear that there were some real lapses of judgment, both exercised according to the reports that the DA and the Attorney General's office put out. The Preet Bharara's office put out, that in fact there were, again, lapses of judgment, and that there were some critical moments in which they did not necessarily observe the spirit of the law, of election law, and that mistakes were made. He deflected that during the press conference today. He was very clear that
I didn't see the press conference.
He was very clear about the fact that they had done things right, and in fact he would not necessarily signal that there would be a change in how he conducted the rest of the campaign now, that he would in fact be essentially doing the same thing. That being said, I don't know how much of that, the word was not exoneration as much as it was clarity.
Right.
Now there's a real clarity.
David, do you think this affects anything about the election? And certainly the poll numbers appear to show that he's well on his way to re-election. Do you think this makes it clear that people like Scott Stringer or even our own borough president will say, well, you know what, this is not the time to challenge the incumbent? What do you think?
No, that's true, because I think now this paves the way for de Blasio to actually win. Right now he's running on pretty much an anti-Trump agenda, and I think that is sort of like his strategy right now, and he's pounding the drum on Trump simply because New Yorkers just don't like Trump, and so he's sort of been perceived as just sort of this leader and just this voice against anything that President Trump can do. And I think what we basically said, Comptroller Scott Stringer, he said that he would consider a run if de Blasio is indicted, but now he's no longer indicted.
The last time he was on Bronx Talk, which I think was probably in the late fall, and I asked him would he consider it. Of course, he wouldn't weigh in on, because he said, well, let's let the legal system play itself out. I will just reveal it on the show. On April 3rd, he will be back on Bronx Talk, and we will find out a little bit more about what his thinking is.
To David's point, the optics of this afternoon were interesting. He held, the mayor and all of the deputy mayors and all of the heads of the agencies held a press conference essentially assailing the Trump administration for the release of the federal budget and being very specific, as much as they could with the skinny budget that was released, about how it was that it would be detrimental to New Yorkers on the housing front, on the education front, on the anti-terrorist.
There's no limit to how difficult this would be.
So that was the first cut, right? And that was really the brunt of the press conference, in which he again deployed all of the resources of the administration to speak very specifically to how it is that we're going to be imperiled by the proposed budget, the federal budget. And then we turn to the second part of the press conference, in which he's being asked about this investigation, the investigations about which he's being cleared, and he can sort of tie that into, look, I am not Trump. I'm not this guy. Right? I've just been cleared of any wrongdoing, so let's move on.
Well, then I will move on, and I'm going to ask you both. Do you think that this notion of creating 90 new homeless shelters, which was his response to what is an ongoing crisis, do you think there are many communities in the city who are going to say, you know what, you're screwing us, we don't like you as mayor and maybe look for alternatives.
Well, we're in the right borough to have that conversation.
Yeah, that's
right?
why I'm asking that question.
We're frankly
all the neighborhoods are very concerned.
Right, and especially in the Bronx should be. We're overburdened. We have the highest rate of shelters in terms of we in fact have been having this conversation while the rest of the city hasn't quite caught up. We've been saying that this is an issue for us, and we're wondering for years, and we're wondering now when you say 90, how many of those 90 are you planning on relocating here?
Well,
placing here?
David, the first indication was that it was going to be in, and here's the little play on words. It's going to be they're going to be located in communities where homeless people exist or come from.
Right.
And I can understand wanting to do that. On the other hand, then you really are oversaturating communities and making it that much more difficult for them to do better for themselves. Norwood worried? Woodlawn? What
yeah,
areas?
no, definitely.
I know that Community Board 12 is quite worried up in the Gun Hill.
Well, right,
area.
because they have the Mueller Center
Yeah,
that's sort of been pending for a very long time.
They've been dealing with it for years.
So with respect to Norwood, I had done a story a couple months ago about the possibility of a shelter coming into a piece of property that right now is a carpet store, a huge carpet store, very successful. And so when that happened, Community Board 7, they mobilized like you wouldn't believe. And I think the idea there is because right now there's 2 cluster sites. You know what those are, so hopefully. And so right now, the Community Board 7 feels like it already has its share of homeless shelter, but that's only the ones that they know. Just bear in mind that the Department of Homeless Services does not have to say where they're going to go ahead and put these homeless shelters.
Right, because there's an interest in protecting the families as
well.
So
I think you were both at the borough president's, like I was at his State of the Borough speech, and he talked a lot about supportive housing and building supportive housing. And in just about every project that I can see coming up, there is some sense of we need a community program or space in there. Are we getting there? And why wouldn't the mayor see that as a better solution than just finding yet another temporary stay for many people?
Well, I think if you remember the rollout of that particular plan, he was very keen on tamping down expectations and saying this is not about pretending that there's going to be a silver bullet here, that we need to look at this and know that essentially our rate of success is going to be meager, is going to be modest, but something will change as a result of really building
because
up
we'll
the
get them
infrastructure.
off the streets.
Right, but here's the idea, and I think we all agree. There's an immediate need for housing. People have got to be able to have somewhere safe to sleep at night, particularly when you're talking about over a third of the population being children. That being said, you also need to know that there's special needs here need to be supported by integrated services.
We got just about a minute. I'm going to change the subject totally. We're just going to ask your opinion. What's going to happen with the American Health Care Act? Do you think it's going to be modified and passed? Do you think it's going to be rejected? Or do you think it's going to be passed as is? Those are 3 choices.
I have a feeling that it's just going to be outright rejected.
Outright rejected. You think modified and passed? Or
I think that the Republicans are going to be in a tizzy about this for long enough to see exactly what the Democrats went through. And I don't know about rejection. I believe something will pass. I do.
I do too. I think politically they're going to do whatever they can to figure it out. Anyway, I feel better about the borough of the Bronx because I know that Deborah Lee Santos has got a typewriter in her hands, and David Cruz has the same, and also staffs of people that they work covering the Bronx. So thank the Norwood News, thank the Bronx Press for both of you. And we will be back with the Bronx Buzz next week. And this Monday night on Bronx Talk, very interesting, Michael Blake, the Bronx Assemblyman, who is now the Vice President of the Democratic National Committee. So that will be a fascinating program. We'll see you at that time, Monday night at 9 o'clock. Otherwise, see you. Good night. Thanks.